And welcome back, fellow football fanatics. It's good to be here on a Thursday at noon Eastern Time today. We won't have the national topics, but we will have a lot of team-specific stuff that I imagine you guys will be very excited for. We're going to discuss why Oregon's a different team this year and some just discussions about what their staff said in spring camp that I really like. Not anything like direct quotes or long, boring paragraphs or a complete deep dive into the press conference, but just some things that I picked up on reading, different insider reports, whether it was 24/7 Sports or Sports Illustrated or following some of their insiders on Twitter. Just things that are out there that have common knowledge. I'm not reporting on any of the paid stuff they have that's only for paid subscribers. Just stuff that's out there. And then breakout players from Michigan and Georgia. We're going to be continuing that series of discussing breakout players for different teams' offenses and defenses. We'll have a look at Lincoln Riley's report card entering year 5. And there are some other topics, including a bold prediction at the end of the video. Make sure to like the stream, to subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. Do all of those things. I very much greatly appreciate it. And thank you for tuning in. It's been a blast to be back and to be able to focus on this full time. So thank you for making that possible. If you want to support the channel monetarily, you can sign up on my Patreon page. The link of that is in the description. And if you send in a super chat, I will highlight it on the live show. There will be a timestamp so that others get to see it after the live show is done and uploaded to YouTube. And you get to suggest, comments or content or other things for me to react to, even if you don't use a super chat for that feature. If you say something interesting, I will reply to it. So be active in the chat. For Oregon, I think that's the best place to start out because it's been pretty obvious to everyone who watches this channel that I'm high on Oregon this year. Why am I high on Oregon this year? Everyone's always telling me, well, they're just a regular season paper tiger. They always lose in the playoffs. They always lose when it matters most. Dan Lanning, he doesn't have big wins. He's not a really good game day coach. And I think so much of that is overreactions. It is recency biased to how they finished poorly over the past 2 years. I get that. And it's dramatically overblown. And that's where we're at in the college football media space right now, and we're seeing it. We're seeing it unfolding live. Like, Oregon is ranked or rated consensusly outside the top 5 entering the season. Notre Dame, Texas, Ohio State, Georgia, now in most post-spring polls, are ranked ahead of them. And in some cases, Miami and Indiana are too. It's pretty wild when I think that this team and staff clearly have access to the best roster, or second best if maybe you have Texas as the best roster in all of college football. Oregon's undervalued. They're underrated, and this is a big season for them. Dan Lanning, Drew Mehringer, and Chris Hampton are pointing to this team being a different squad. Oregon's coaching staff is telling you that this is a different team, a more dangerous, vicious animal to deal with than in prior seasons. Dan Lanning and his 2 new coordinators, Drew Mehringer and Chris Hampton, have actually been together for quite some time. Mehringer was previously the co-OC and tight ends coach, Hampton being the co-defensive coordinator and secondary coach. There's more familiarity in that staff and within that building than I think a lot of national analysts are discussing in the preseason. Oregon is certainly an undervalued team. I've seen polls have them as low as 8th. Most polls I see have them outside of the top 5. And that is moving, the national media is moving in the opposite direction on Oregon as this program in reality, not in the hypotheticals, is moving. Oregon's program in the preseason is sending a very implicit, tacit message, and I don't know if people are picking up on it. This program has only trended up year over year over year. In 2024, yeah, they're a worse quality team than they were in 2023, but instead of going 0-2 in big games, they go 2-1 in big games, beating Penn State and Ohio State and then losing to Ohio State in the Rose Bowl rematch. In 2025, they win 13 games again, they go even further in the college football playoff, and they look more talented than the 2024 team. And now entering this season with recruiting classes that are top 4 and have been top 4 every year since the 2024 recruiting class, and back-to-back classes in the 2025 and 2026 high school classes that were number 1 in overall quality, average rank per recruit, how is this Oregon team not going to get better? They're in the top 12 of returning production. They're in the top 5 unanimously, or top 3 or 2 of preseason ratings, and yet polls, people who don't watch the sport or just, casual observers who pretend to be more than that, have them outside the top 3. This staff is discussing this Ducks squad in terms of, Elijah Rushing's really coming on. Aiden Breland is different. He's found a new motor to his game. We like how Dante Moore now has a full command of the offense, and Dylan Raiola and Akili Smith are battling for the QB2 spot. We like how our young receivers and tight end looks, and Kendra Harrison is just an absolute freak of nature. They are talking about players that, in some cases like Dante Moore, will decide the season, but in other cases are more so contributors, rotational pieces, break glass in cases of emergency pieces, rather than the main course. And what that tells you is that the Oregon staff is confident in their main pieces. That's what the Dante Moore message was about. That was an explicit statement about how, he's the guy, he's as ready as the prior quarterbacks in Bo Nix and Dylan Gabriel were, and he's more talented than Dylan Gabriel. And he is going to be picked in the first round, much like Bo Nix was. To give that level of praise means that he is better than last season, where at times Dante Moore just didn't look ready to face opposing defenses or was still clearly getting comfortable as a first-year starter. Every other message surrounding this is implicit, and it backs my preseason research and other preseason research of those who know what they're talking about, mostly those who have models that have Oregon preseason top 3, top 2, in some cases number 1, where this team was top 10 in basically every metric that matters. They were power rated unanimously top 3 last season, oftentimes third in between Notre Dame and Ohio State. FEI, for example, had them ahead of Ohio State, and ESPN's efficiency did too before that bad loss to Indiana in the Peach Bowl. Oregon being 6th in points per play margin and top 20 in EPA per play and success rate margin, which those are not really strength of schedule adjusted. 4th in FPI and S&P Plus, 2nd in FEI, 5th in PFF, 5th in efficiency, 2nd in game control. This team was close to being elite last year. They were just a few pieces, few decisions away from that. And look, in the college football playoff, when you have 2 coordinators that are hired as head coaches at other positions at schools, you're going to be distracted a bit. And Indiana DC Bryant Haynes even said that on a now deleted tweet about how Oregon's offense the second time around just wasn't as imposing or intimidating to face. And his reasoning was Stein was distracted, and Oregon fans and national media types and Oregon insiders were basically saying something similar in the lead up to that Peach Bowl. They were very young last season. Brandon Finney was a true freshman. Dante Moore was draft eligible, yes, but he was only in, he played 23, 24, 25. He was only in his 3rd season. Now he's going to be in his 4th. Deere Hill Jr. and Jordan Davison were true freshmen. DeCorian Moore was a true freshman. These are all players that had ridiculous amounts of playing time. That entire D-line that's now seniors, And Nasir Wyatt, who contributed some, was a true freshman. Wyatt's now a sophomore. The entire starting D-line are seniors for a unit that last year had a top 10 defense, a top 10 offense. At times, those units flirted with the top 5 in their respective positions. And now they're vying to have a surefire top 5 offense, top 5 defense. And there's a path for them to be number 1 at both, and certainly number 1 in one of those categories. Look at this offense from last year and put the performance of last year's offense within the context of the Oregon coaches and people who watch the sport and analyze it for a living, telling you that, hey, Dante Moore's a bit uncomfortable at quarterback, and saying that he now has the mastery of the offense like Dylan Gabriel or like Bo Nix is implying that he really didn't have that mastery last year. And despite that, they were top 15 in touchdowns per game, scoring 4.1. They were 8th in points per play, scoring 0.525. Behind Indiana in the Big Ten, yes, but also ahead of Ohio State. They were 10th in punts per score, 8th in yards per carry. And they struggled a bit with turnovers, sometimes with protecting the quarterback, and struggled in the red zone a bit. But with how much they return, they will improve in all of those areas. I know they technically lose a lot on the offensive line, but Isaiah World was undrafted. Harkey was a day 3 talent. With how they recruit and develop on the offensive line and at tackle, last year's Oregon starting tackle duo was actually one of the more inferior Oregon tackle duos in recent memory. And I would expect them to regress to the mean in a positive way there and improve at that position. Guard is a bit different with Pregnan leaving, and he was their best offensive lineman last year, but returning Lololu and Dave Iuli on the interior is going to help a lot. You would expect an improvement in passing, rushing, really an improvement at every position here, or reloading at every position. And that is even with losing Kenyon Sadiq on offense, losing Malik Benson at wide receiver, who was very reliable down the stretch, and losing some of the players they did on the offensive line. It's an offense that last year had some inconsistencies, yes, in big games, like against Indiana, but then again, Indiana's defense and efficiency was up there with Ohio State's and Texas Tech's. And now that entire unit comes back. And they were one of the only teams to score more than 20 points on Indiana, which they did both times. So I don't know what to tell you. I mean, if you're doubting the offense, maybe because of OC Drew Maringer, or you're worried about the O-line or Dante Moore taking the next step, well, fine. But there's no universe in which this offense is worse than it was last year. That's not possible with how much they bring back and the continuity they have. We then go to the defense. And I don't think this defense is going to be anything but a top 5 unit. I have it pegged as a defense that is competing with Indiana's for the best in America. They have the most talented D-line. They've upgraded talent-wise at linebacker. Corner is only going to get better as they return both their starters there. Theron Johnson didn't pan out, and it hurt them, but Brandon Finney was an All-American as a freshman, and he's only going to get better. Ife Obadegwu, Naeem Offord, anyone else in that cornerback room, they're going to be better. And safety, bringing in Coy Parrish, bringing in Williams from Baylor, returning Aaron Flowers, and with how they've recruited at that position, Peyton Woodyard got him in the portal. Hopefully Trey McNutt can be healthy after being injured. They're just deeper across the board. They're better. Their starters are better at most positions except for maybe D tackle. Their depth is significantly better. I like what I'm seeing out of that unit. And I believe that at OC, you can probably make an argument they're going to downgrade there for sure. Stein was a good OC. Maringer has never really been a play caller before. He was at Rutgers in the 2010s. Completely different system, different era. Hampton's been a play caller before for a few years at Tulane. And Lupoy has never exactly been known as a fantastic play caller on defense. Just hasn't been. So I think there's a pretty good chance that Oregon is upgraded there. And when you listen to these coaches talk, the position coaches, Tuioti, the D-line coach, for example, he's talking about Nasir Wyatt, Aiden Breland, Elijah Rushing, some other players. There's no mention of the starters. And why is there no mention of the starters? Because the starters are living up to the expectations of Dan Lanning, the man who was the DC of Georgia's 2021 defense, the best defense of the 2020s by quite a bit. When you look at, tempo adjusted points per play allowed, they allowed 0.15 points per play, which is just insane. That D-line, the depth, the bodies, the potential, you could have 2 to 3 first-rounders who are starting off that line, like Clemson's did in 18 or Georgia's did in 21 and was close to in 22. And there are pieces behind them that could also in the future be drafted on day 1 or certainly day 2. There's a lot to like about this team. And when you return 2/3 of your production from last year, and it's accounting for all you lose on the O-line, losing a weapon like Sadiq, losing Benson, and they do lose Dylan Thieneman and Betcher, some of their leading tacklers on defense, which returning production on defense is a lot about, total tackles and, some havoc plays like tackles for loss. On offense, returning production doesn't care much about running back. That's why Notre Dame's at 72%, even though running back was super important to them. And Oregon didn't use the portal all that much, and there they are, towards the top of returning production. And out of all these teams on this list, in the top 12, guess who was the best in consensus ratings? It was Oregon. Oregon was the best in consensus ratings. And who recruits the best out of the teams on this 12 list? Well, again, it's Oregon. Who has put the most NFL players on this list in recent memory? It's been Georgia and Texas, and then Oregon. And Oregon put, more players in the draft this past season than Texas did. Not quite as much as Georgia, I don't believe, but they were close. Like Oregon, much like Texas and Georgia, is an NFL factory here. And these rankings are provided by, of course, the GOAT, Bill Connolly. This defensive line is one of the biggest reasons why I'm high on this team. Mateo Uyunglele, Bear Alexander, Amari Washington, Tatum Tuioti, they return a combined 18 sacks between these four. They didn't get a ton of pressure, probably not as much as they would have liked last year, but play calling could have had a hand in that. We've seen that Derek Harmon, for example, get picked in the first round off the defensive line. We've seen other players from Oregon's defensive line in the past have success. Amari Washington was a projected first-rounder this year. Uyunglele, Tuioti, and Alexander probably would have all been day 2 picks or maybe at the very worst early day 3 picks. And they all come back. All to do the same thing that Penn State tried to do but failed, that Indiana basically didn't succeed at, and same with Ohio State and Michigan that came before them. Okay, we're going to rally the troops. We know we can do this. We weren't that far away. I know people will say, well, they lost by 34, or the prior year was by 20, and really it was more like 40. Ohio State just let their foot off the gas. But Michigan, in 22, they lost to TCU. TCU was not a great team. They were good at best. You saw what Georgia did to them. I think Michigan would have made it more competitive than TCU, but would they really have beaten that Georgia team? And they made pretty big strides the following year to then win. Ohio State in 2023, I think if they beat Michigan, they probably win it all. But how often were they beating Michigan on the road in the Big House? Probably if Harbaugh was there 1 time out of 10, with Sharon Moore being there, maybe it's 3 or 4, but they didn't. And with the 4-team playoff, it was going to be hard for them to get in. They come back, they rally the troops, they do make a noticeable improvement, and they win it all. Indiana in 2024, that team was never winning it all in a zillion years. Had far less of a chance to do so than Michigan or Ohio State in 22 and 23. They get pieces in the portal, they bring a lot of other key pieces back, and they go out, and they go 16-0, the first ever team in the modern era to do so. So, Oregon is using the strategies required to win a title. You evaluate well, you develop well, you are experienced, and you have good coaching. Dante Moore, he comes back and he could be round one, pick one. If not, he could still contend for being the best quarterback in college football. He had 30 touchdowns and 10 interceptions last year. He was 15th in QBR, completed over 70% of his passes, and had 3,565 passing yards. NFL quarterback, an NFL defensive line, they have some NFL receivers, and they also have NFL defensive backs. Possibly now they have NFL linebackers, even. And Jamari Johnson could be a first-round pick. When your coach is 48-8, and people are complaining about winning big games, you know you're so close to the tip of Mount Everest. That's where Oregon is. They are in the exact same position that Ohio State and Ryan Day were entering 2024, where the fool would say, oh, Ryan Day's never won big games. He's just living off Urban's legacy. Not realizing that basically by 2022 or 2023, almost no one starting for that team was recruited by Meyer. They were all Day recruits, developed by Day, and those teams were very close to winning it all. Oregon in 23, 24, and 25 has been close. They have. If things bounce a little bit differently, they could have won it all in one of those seasons. Now, you're looking at a program that has a lot of pressure to win it all. They've made the playoffs for 2 years in a row, and if the 12-team playoff existed in 2023, it would be 3 years in a row. They've had back-to-back 13-win seasons. They went from 8th in FPI in 2024 to 3rd, well, technically 4th in 2025, but I hate how like FPI loves teams that blow out bad teams with soft schedules. In no way should Notre Dame have been ahead of them in FPI or most serious power ratings. And he's produced a first-round quarterback before. He's won the Big Ten title. He's 2-2 in the CFP. He's beaten Ryan Day, and that is a good big win. And he's basically 500 against the top 20, against the top 10. And if you look at what he's done against FPI teams, he's had some struggles against them. But beating the national champion, even if you lost to them by a lot more in the postseason, is still an impressive feat. And beating Texas Tech counts as a top 10 FPI win. Going on the road and beating Iowa and Washington, those are wins that can set you up to eventually beat even better teams. I don't understand the Dan Lanning hate. I don't. It's the same thing with Sark. Freeman doesn't get as much public hate, but for people that say, for example, that Freeman is like basically James Franklin or whatever, that's dumb too. These coaches just can't win the big game until suddenly they do, and then they've always been that good. That's how it works in college football. Let's take a look at Oregon's schedule before closing out this segment here. They play Boise State, Oklahoma State on the road, Portland State, at USC, UCLA, Nebraska, at Illinois, Northwestern, at Ohio State, Michigan, at Michigan State, and Washington, with a win total of 10.5 that is juiced to the under, and that makes sense when you play USC, Ohio State, and Oklahoma State on the road, and then Michigan and Washington are going to be tough outs at home. I love this team. I do. This is a team that is definitely top 2 in power ratings. Definitely. And they have the best defensive roster in the country. They might have the best college quarterback in America. And when you look at returning production and you factor in the quality of said returning production, and you look at how good the teams were last year and project a bit, I think Oregon is the strongest case out of anyone to be preseason number 1. Texas, you might say, had the better portal class. Texas also wasn't a top 10 team last year. And Sark has not done as well record-wise in big games as Lanning has. You could say Notre Dame, who is closer to Oregon in ratings, and Freeman and Lanning are comparable in, the big game wins. But I would point to the fact that, look, Lanning beat a loaded Ohio State team. Freeman has not beaten a team that loaded quite yet. And Oregon was better. In some ratings, they were just worse because they played a much tougher schedule. Notre Dame had the privilege of not facing up against Indiana, who would have also been a very tough matchup for them, as they were for Oregon. This team is setting the stage to send a message and be a different team than Oregon teams that have came before them. They have possibly their most loaded roster in school history. That's rare. especially for an era where it's hard to build depth. And Oregon has been somewhat of an exception there. So don't buy into people fading Oregon. Don't follow these preseason polls that are placing them outside the top 5. They are leading you off a cliff. This team is different. The staff knows it. The people inside know. And the outside observers who do their research, like myself and probably hundreds or thousands of others, they know too. Don't sell Oregon. This team's undervalued. They're underrated. Buy as much preseason stock in them as you can. Probably should have inserted a question there to gain engagement in the comment sections. That's something that I sometimes forget to do, but I'm a firm believer in this team to... My eyes are a bit sore. Happens when you're staring at a computer for most of the day. I'm a firm believer in them. I think that they are going to be one of the best teams, if not the best teams in college football this year. And I don't understand how you can look at that roster and that program and that staff and think, oh yeah, they're going to be like worse than they were last year. That's nonsense. That's total nonsense. But the polls in general are nonsense. Even from most like college football accounts, like it's college football accounts, it's the USA Today poll, it's the preseason AP poll. Most of them are pretty bad. Pretty bad. Now I want to take a look. Now I want to take a look at Michigan's breakout players offensively, and we'll also talk about Georgia's defensively. Jason Beck has worked magic at Utah, at New Mexico, and at Virginia. The Syracuse stop in between I'll blame on Dino Babers, who is unemployed right now. Offensive coordinator Jason Beck is a wizard, engineering turnarounds with Devin Dampier at Utah and at New Mexico, and turning Brennan Armstrong into a weapon and good quarterback at Virginia, where he was never that for the rest of his career. Bryce Underwood's come under some criticism post-spring with how he performed in the spring game. But with Jason Beck's history, you would assume that he and a Michigan offense that were very inconsistent last year, despite having talent, are going to take a step forward. So who is going to break out under Jason Beck, Jim Hardy, Ty Detmer, or I think it's... Did I mess that up? It is Coy Detmer, not Ty Detmer. Or maybe I'm... Yeah, I did mess that up. Yeah. My apologies. My apologies there. It's not Ty. It's not Ty Detmer. Can Jason Beck engineer the same offensive turnaround at Michigan that he did at Utah, New Mexico, and that he also had a hand in at Virginia with head coach Bronco Mendenhall coaching there up until the 2021 season, and they had a pretty prolific offense that year. Mendenhall also had a good offense with Beck at New Mexico in 2024, and Beck went to Whittingham in Utah in 2025, where they were coming off a 5-7 season, and they had an 11-2 turnaround with a prolific top 5 offense last year. Which players are going to step up under new offensive coordinator Jason Beck and Kyle Whittingham and his staff? Well, let's see. I think that the most important piece to understanding Michigan's progress on offense is the turnaround. I mentioned it earlier, but I didn't give you any data. So, looking at this data from pre-Jason Beck at Utah to post-Jason Beck at Utah, it's a 2-year sample size here. In 2024, Utah's offense was outside of the top 75 in every metric on your screen here. They were outside the top 100 in touchdowns per game, red zone touchdown percentage, third down conversion percentage, turnovers per game. Their QB sacked percentage was pretty bad. It was one of the worst offenses in all of college football. It looked like it was going to be pretty okay with Cameron Rising, but then he got hurt, and I don't think they had any other QB behind him that could manage the offense. Then Devin Dampier transfers in with his OC back at New Mexico, Jason Beck. And at the end of 2025, Utah's offense was top 5 in touchdowns per game, red zone touchdown percentage, third down conversion percentage. They were top 5 in yards per rush, averaging 6.3. They were top 25 in turnovers per game and QB sacked percentage. Yards per pass was 47th, but still top 50 at 7.1. And I think we can all agree that Devin Dampier is much more limited as a passer than Bryce Underwood. He just does not have the same talent. So looking at that turnaround from 24 to 25, the turnaround New Mexico had from 23 to 24 under Beck, and what Beck was involved in at Virginia with Robert Anai as the OC, but Beck working behind the scenes, especially in the passing attack, we would expect Michigan to have plenty of players that break out and take steps forward. And I think Bryce Underwood is the most logical choice here to be a breakout player. As a true freshman, he did struggle, but he showed some flashes. He had a PFF grade of 70, had a QBR of 72.6, which was 29th. 11 touchdowns to 9 interceptions isn't that good. But he didn't have a QB coach. And we know from Sharon Moore and the details that came out of that whole situation that staff was constantly at each other's throats. There was no alignment. Communication was poor. Why shouldn't he take a step forward in 2026? Why wouldn't he? I think that you're not going to get Cam Newton play when he was in his senior year at Auburn out of Bryce Underwood, but I also don't think you're going to get the quarterback that you saw last year. I know people will point to the spring game or the fact that he struggled in spring practice, but it is a year 1 to year 2 jump. He does have a superior offensive coordinator to what he had last year. He has a superior QB coach, a better culture, just everything at Michigan with how bad that staff was, with how disjointed they were. Everything at Michigan is better this year than it was last year, and I would expect Underwood, a 5-star QB with just unlimited upside, to show more of that upside and be more consistent this fall. Savion Hyder is a player who is going to be a true freshman phenom. At over 6 foot, over 200 pounds, number 1 running back, and number 1 recruit out of the state of Virginia, 12th overall per both Rivals and 24/7 Sports. You are looking at someone who I think is going to be Michigan's Travion Henderson in year 1, where he comes onto the field, immediately has success as a top-end running back, and is recognized as one of the better running backs in college football. The staff has given him limitless praise. He is, mixing in with Jordan Marshall to be running back number 1. Obviously, Marshall will probably start the year at running back 1, but Hyder's talent is phenomenal. And in this system, with the new coaching, where Jason Beck last year at Utah ran a lot of RPO that was predicated on Devin Dampier and his legs and the offensive line being one of the best in America and their rushing attack, I imagine these running backs and Underwood's legs are going to benefit here. And Michigan will have one of the most productive rushing offenses in the country. Last year, their rushing offense was pretty damn good. It was the least of their problems. And most of those players, outside of Justice Haynes, Jordan Marshall, Cusdahl, the entire offensive line, Underwood, some of the tight ends, and then they all return, and then Hyder comes in. I love the outlook for Michigan's rushing offense this year. I believe it's going to be one of the best in all of college football, and that would be something that more than any other position for Michigan, I'm confident in. And I believe Savion Hyder will be a big piece of that. Celesi Moa transferred in from Utah, where he was a player there for just a very brief period of time. And he's been talked about as competing for a starting wide receiver spot as a true freshman. He's from Utah. He was a borderline 5-star out of high school, number 2 athlete per 24/7 Sports, number 1 per Rivals, 42nd best player in both recruiting services rankings. He just has a type of athleticism to him that outside of Andrew Marsh and maybe J.J. Buchanan, Michigan hasn't seen in a while. Buchanan is also a newcomer. He's not quite listed as a breakout player just because he's a known commodity who's been talked about already. But pay attention to Celeste Moa and also Jamie French Jr. in the wide receiver room. It's definitely Buchanan, Marsh. Those are the starting two. And then to look at that starting third spot and who's going to be a key fourth receiver, I think it's a battle right now between French and Moa. There are some others, of course, who were carryovers from the prior regime, but I'd be paying attention to these guys as they're more talented. French was highly recruited out of high school. He did play for Texas last year, did redshirt, didn't see the field that much, then transferred away to Michigan. I don't quite know about Michigan's receivers outside of the top two, but again, these are the names that I keep hearing. Those are the names that they got in the portal or out of high school recruiting that were highly touted athletes. And outside of Andrew Marsh, Michigan doesn't really have that in their room. They have a freshman whose name escapes me that was highly recruited in this cycle, but I don't know if he is quite ready. He's pretty raw. Zach Marshall at tight end should have a pretty good campaign, 199 receiving yards, a touchdown on 16 receptions. He made some pretty fantastic catches last year, and at 6 foot, 245 pounds, he has the build to be tight end one and a pretty good tight end in Big Ten play. Utah has had success with tight ends previously under Kyle Whittingham. J.J. Buchanan was kind of a hybrid tight end wide receiver last year. And with this rushing offense that Utah's kind of bringing in from their prior system and the success that he had last year with a worse coaching staff, I would expect him to possibly double his receiving yards or at least get to around 300 despite the tougher competition. This Michigan offense is going to improve. It just depends on how large the improvements are. It's the same thing with the defense, with how much they bring back, with the staff they have, with what's been revealed about the prior staff. They're going to improve in all phases, except for maybe linebacker because they lost their top three linebackers there. Anyway, a part of how successful this offense will come from the offensive line play, but I think especially the tackle play. Michigan was inconsistent in run blocking last year, but better there than they were in pass blocking. And the tackles did struggle. Sprague, for example, is a unit and is someone who has the measurables to be a future first rounder. Allowed 20 pressures and a sack, though. And his pass blocking and run blocking was not very high, to say the least. Just was not. So he has to improve. And Blake Frazier has to improve. And Guanera and Afabi and Norton and anyone who's starting on that offensive line, the backups, they have to get better. Especially if the concerns about Bryce Underwood pan out where, yes, he gets better than he was last year, but not to such a degree where that compensates for the schedule getting tougher. If this offensive line pans out as a top 10 unit, you're talking about a rushing attack that most defenses and maybe no defenses can stop. If they just minimally improve, well, Michigan with this schedule could be in trouble. I'm pretty confident that Sprague will take a huge step forward with new O-line coach Jim Harding. Another offensive tackle who I'm not quite as confident in only because of his injury is Andrew Babalola. Babalola was a 5-star in Rivals and 24/7 Sports recruiting rankings. He also has the build and measurables to possibly be a future first-rounder. Michigan's recruited at a very high level on the offensive line over the past 2 years. The problem has been development and scheme. That won't be a problem with the new staff. But can Babalola get healthy to a point where he can be competing for that starting job in fall camp? Because with this team, the more competition they have at different positions, that's a good sign, outside of maybe quarterback where there should be a massive talent gap. But the more competition at every other position, the better. And he has higher upside than Blake Frazier. We haven't seen him play yet because he was injured for all of last year, but he has higher upside. And with this new coaching staff, I would not be shocked if he has a higher floor too, as long as he gets some reps and gets some time in the new system. Again, when you look at Michigan's offense through the lens of Utah's last season, Utah entered 2025 with far worse offensive metrics the previous season than this Michigan offense has entering 2026. The staff has access to new talent. They are also going to play tougher defenses, but that should balance each other out. Right now, Michigan's offense I do have projected as a top 15 unit in college football. We'll have to see if it's top 10. Last year, Utah's was borderline top 5, and even in opponent-adjusted efficiency metrics, it was top 10. The O-line and the rushing game in general I have the most confidence in, and I do think tight end, receiver, and QB all improve, but are all of those units top 10? I wouldn't say so right now. Receiver, tight end, and QB, not quite. The running back room and O-line right now I would tab as top 10, given the position coaches they have, the makeup they have in those rooms with the talent and experience they have. If I expect Michigan to improve in one thing last year to this year, it would be points per play and red zone touchdown percentage. That's the one area where I think they're going to take a major step forward in. They did do a good job last year moving the ball at least to midfield or in between the 20s, but they just completely lost it in the red zone, and I don't think you'll see that this year. Keep in mind that last year, Michigan was top 10 in EPA per rush. They were a top 25 offense in FEI and efficiency, and in S&P Plus, they were top 50. They did improve from 2024 by quite a bit offensively. The problem was on defense, they were outside of the top 25 in every major category, except for S&P Plus. And that's because S&P Plus, I think, cares more about scoring and, is good. And I like what Connolly does, but it just uses a different methodology that I don't like as much as, say, FEI or efficiency, which I think care more about the current season more so and look at more like EPA per play stuff. So some more like stuff that you can say is overvalued or explains behind the scenes how each team operates. They just have different methodologies. But universally, Michigan's defense was worse than the offense last year in most categories. Michigan's special teams were also dreadful, and that was after having a pretty good kicking game in 2024, which shows they weren't well coached. It was just a bad mental situation. I think you're going to see this team take a big step forward. And keep in mind, last year they were a top 25 team in ratings. They had a top 15 talent roster, and now they probably have a top 10 staff, could even be considered top 5 by some. So just look at the metrics here. The power ratings, the points per play margin, they were top 25 in a lot of these areas. And I can't wait to see what the new staff does. Michigan has had a string of several bad hires in the 21st century. Rich Rodriguez, Brady Hoke, Sharon Moore. They've also had, Lloyd Carr, who they hired right before the 21st century, and Jim Harbaugh that panned out quite nicely. And just looking at the resumes of these different coaches, I would have to imagine that Whittingham is closer to a Harbaugh or Carr type coach than a Rich Rod, Hoke, or Sharon Moore. Thankfully, I already forgot about Sharon Moore. If he does fail, it will be a lot like Rich Rod, where the cultures just don't mesh and the university doesn't back him. But a team that was 20th in FPI last year, 21st in FEI, 25th in S&P Plus, and had a success rate and points per play margin inside the top 30 with that staff, they're going to be much better in all those areas in 2026. So on offense, I would expect pretty much every position to improve compared to where it was last year. Tell me down below which Michigan players you think will break out this fall. For Georgia's defense was not good last year, but a lot of that had to do with them being young. After a year of turmoil, a year of youth and inexperience, and improving week over week, but still falling short in the Sugar Bowl against Ole Miss, will an added year of conditioning, learning, coaching, experience help Georgia's defense evolve into a top 10 unit? Let's look at some breakout players on this defense, because I do right now project Georgia to have a top 10 defense entering 2026. Elijah Griffin has to be the first player mentioned. A defensive tackle who's a true sophomore, 6'4", 310 pounds. He's been compared to Jalen Carter and other legendary Georgia defensive tackles by Georgia's staff and Georgia insiders. He had 22 total tackles, 14 solo tackles, a sack, 14 pressures, and a 71.6 PFF grade. Elijah Griffin is going to be an All-American player this year. He was already in the rotation, and I believe maybe starting even in some games as a true freshman. Be a full-time starter this year, have another year in the program, training, getting faster, lighter in the terms of feet, not in terms of weight, stronger, twitchier. I love what Georgia's defense has in terms of personnel up front on the defensive tackle group. We'll get to the linebackers in a minute. And even at D-end, I like what they have. Georgia doesn't exactly have elite defensive end play, at least based on the past few years, but they produced Michael Williams, who was a first-rounder. They have a lot of talent there, and remember, they were young, and now they have a whole different year with basically continuity on the roster across the board on both sides of the football. Joseph Jonah Ajonye had a 66 PFF grade, 15 pressures, didn't produce any sacks or TFLs, though. He has to turn some of those pressures into, tangible production. Sacks, TFLs, pressures can be helpful, but if they don't lead to a sack or a turnover, and if they don't lead to an incompletion, they're leading to a completion. And that was Georgia's problem last year. They did an okay job getting pressure later in the year, but they just couldn't finish against some of the quarterbacks they faced, and that gave them plenty of issues against Ole Miss in that Sugar Bowl, where Chambliss just had a great game, as great quarterbacks do, and that was all that was needed to beat Georgia on that day. 6'4", 275 pounds, 5-star from Texas in his third year after redshirting and seeing limited action last year. I'd expect him to have a big year. Justin Williams, moving on to the linebacker position. We already know about Chris Cole, and we already know about Raylan Wilson. When you add in Justin Williams and another linebacker we'll be talking about in just a minute, Georgia might have the best and deepest linebacker room in college football. Williams had a 70.3 PFF grade, 5 pressures, 4 tackles for loss, 36 total tackles, and a pass breakup. They were mean and nasty at linebacker last year. And you saw that analytically, where their pass defense, not the greatest, their run defense, top 5. You did not run on Georgia. That was one thing you could not do. It was shown in the game against Alabama, where it's not like they got 10 sacks. They just got a handful, and Alabama finished with -3 rushing yards because Alabama's rushing offense was that bad, and Georgia's rushing defense was just that good. Raylan Wilson was a starter last year. Chris Cole was a key contributor, and returning Justin Williams, who had experience as a true sophomore, and also bringing back Zayden Walker, who played as a true freshman, enough to not get redshirted. That's key to have success on defense. With a 54.7 PFF grade, obviously indicating that he struggled a bit, Zayden Walker earned enough of respect of the staff and was needed enough and could be counted on enough towards a 5-star of Georgia. He played as a true freshman, got 2 sacks, a forced fumble, and 6 total tackles. Georgia has recruited highly at every position, and at times, like all programs, even the ones who recruit perfectly have, they struggle or regress at certain positions. One position where I give Georgia perhaps more benefit of the doubt than anyone else is at linebacker. There are other schools that earn more benefit of the doubt than Georgia at other positions. Linebacker is not one of them. They have 4 linebackers who are probably all SEC caliber this year. And by all SEC, I don't mean you have Georgia's going to occupy the entire first or second team. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about linebackers that will contend for that, especially if you don't look at stats and care more about actual caliber of play. This defense is loaded. And Ellis Robinson IV, who was a starting corner as a redshirt freshman last year, I think he'll take a step forward this year and be one of the better corners in the SEC in college football. He had 4 interceptions, 7 pass breakups, 20 total tackles. And with Dalen Everett leaving, Ellis Robinson and DeMello Jones, they're going to have to hold down that corner room. Those are going to be the key contributors in that position this year. And much like Georgia's defense last year, there was a lot of youth and inexperience, and at times it felt like they were just limited talent-wise at D end and couldn't get to the quarterback. And you hope that with another year, you're going to see progress there. Robinson, blue chipper out of high school. I do trust Georgia on defense, and I trust Kirby Smart probably more than any coach right now other than Curt Cignetti, I would say. I will be candid here and say that I don't exactly trust Georgia's pass rush to be elite, so I trust them to take a step forward due to experience, but I don't expect them to really explode there. However, at linebacker, at D tackle, and at secondary, where they have been pretty good when healthy, I am trusting them to improve. So Ellis Robinson checks all the boxes for me. DeMello Jones I'm not quite as confident in to take a step forward as Ellis Robinson, but with a whole year of starting experience under his belt, he should improve, or at least where he was, rotating in and out. I know that Dalen Everett, Ellis Robinson, and DeMello Jones played up a lot last year. When a cornerback has 24 total tackles, it's not too bad, but is also like you want your corners to tackle as less as possible and be targeted as least as possible, because that shows that your defensive front's taking care of the rushing attack or the QB, or they're having to go out of the backfield because your secondary is just that locked down. And I remember watching Georgia against Ole Miss round 1 last year and thinking to myself, this team can't defend the forward pass, and thinking just how wild that was. Georgia will not have that problem this year. They're going to improve in part because Ellis Robinson and DeMello Jones step up. And finally, looking at Rasheen Dinkins, who according to our lads is the projected starting nickel. Last year, nickel was Jonel Aguero. He transferred out to Ole Miss. They could use better play at that position. Nickel has become a very underrated position in college football as time has evolved and we've moved away from the traditional 4-3 base defense, and most base defenses are now 4-2-5. Even with Georgia, they run a 3-4. Their 3-4 is like a 3-4 scheme, but with 4-2-5 players. And that's how they run it, basically. And that's how they ran it with Kirby Smart's best defense ever, the 2021 defense. At least his best defense ever at Georgia. The 2011 Alabama defense was his best defense ever. But the 2021 Georgia defense with Dan Lanning ran the 4-2-5. And when I look at it here, when I've looked at defenses previously, nickel is important. Like Ohio State in 2024, part of the reason they were so good is Jordan Hancock was all reliable at nickel. Mikey Sainra still from Michigan in 2023, yeah, he got burned at times, but whenever you'd burn him, at least once per game, he'd get a pick on you once per game. He was a great tackler and a very physical player that Nick Saban himself praised. Indiana last year had Devin Boykin at nickel, and he was a very reliable tackler and could even be used as a pass rusher in blitz packages at times. It's a very undervalued position, but one that's important to succeed in. And Dinkins, now being a true sophomore, I would expect him to... Look, if Jonel Aguero transferred out, I think that shows that they trust Rasheen Dinkins to play well at that position. Georgia's defense, was it the greatest in the world last year? No. But look at the spider chart here, where they were pretty good at stopping the run, and even, decent at stopping the pass. They were great in the yards per point, punts per score, and points per play categories. especially when you factor in like the schedule a bit. Like Indiana, Georgia, Oregon, the teams that played tough regular season schedules or advanced in the playoff. Miami, because they played 4 playoff games, counts as this too. You have to kind of positively adjust their stats just a little bit. And when you do that with Georgia, you see the defense was good. At times it was borderline great, but there's no strength of schedule adjustment that can mask the fact their pass rush was awful. To have a 3.8% sack percentage is disgusting. I'm a Michigan fan. People don't really realize that unless I mention it, because I disguise my bias and fandom so well, and I factor it out when I talk about college football, because it's my mission to be objective. Michigan's pass rush was pretty terrible last year, outside of Derek Moore, and even then, the staff didn't do him any favors, and it wasn't like he was a first-rounder. And Michigan's pass rush was significantly better than Georgia's, without the scheme, as good of a scheme that Georgia runs. It was bad. And they didn't take away the football either. And when you can't get takeaways and you can't get pressure, you have to rely on being perfect in coverage, perfect in tackling to prevent teams from moving the ball on you. My friend and I play NCAA, and we played, as two teams in a 2-game series, and he beat me because I couldn't get pressure on him and he could get pressure on me. And that's basically what the game came down to, is he could get pressure and I could not, even though in NCAA 14, my defensive roster was more talented than his. The lines of scrimmage matchup was enough to nullify some of those things. And I don't know as much as these coaches do, not even close. And NCAA is not like college football. But if you can't get pressure, you're not going to win it all. All the most recent national champions did well at getting to the quarterback, at least on a semi-frequent basis. And the ones who didn't do that as much, say Michigan in 2023, were still great at it and so good at stopping the run or getting pressure up the middle where they caused a lot of havoc plays or throwaways. Like Michigan and Ohio State in 23 and 24 didn't exactly have that same crazy upside of the previous Georgia D lines, but they were close, and they were even better than the 22 Georgia line at some things. Indiana last year, they didn't have a D line in terms of NFL talent anywhere close to those, but because they knew how to get in between gaps, get behind line of scrimmage, and get TFLs, and they were perfectly fundamentally sound, strong players, they were able to get pressure with good schematics, and outside of Miami's O-line, they straight up sort of murdered every offensive line that they faced. Georgia really just needs to improve at pass rush and a little bit in pass coverage too. And if that happens, and I think when that happens, they're going to be a much better defense than they were a year ago. This team overall, sure, I probably overvalued it a bit at the end of the year, but it was a top 10 team. There were times where it was borderline top 10, or not top 10, but top 5, around there. And that was with one of the younger starting rosters in the sport. They were like as young as Texas or Michigan in a lot of cases, and they were much better than both of those teams. Now we get to see an older team with continuity on staff and in the roster with an easier schedule. And I got to tell you, just based on who I think is going to break it on this defense and how they'll take a step forward, I think that Georgia has some value in predicting them to make a playoff run or potentially, if you want to be really bold, given the odds preseason, winning a national title and Smart hoisting his 3rd trophy. Let me know who you think is going to break it on this defense. I love its outlook entering the fall. Alrighty. Now we can discuss Lincoln Riley's report card entering year 5. Oh, wow. Let's see what everyone in the chat is saying. Just more stuff about Michigan, it looks like. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure, if you haven't already, to like the show and subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when we go live tomorrow. We're going to go live tomorrow at noon, and then next week, same as this week outside of Monday, we'll be live every single day. Not every single day, but every weekday at noon. Lincoln Riley's report card, entering year 5. I got to take a water break. I recorded earlier this morning with someone for 40 minutes, and my voice is just a bit hoarse. So before we get to that, I'm going to take a quick water break, and then I will be right back, and we'll get the stream done before 2. I'll see you guys really soon. Thank you for your patience. Just had to get that quick drink of water. I feel much better. So now with Lincoln Riley, we've been doing this series for for really 2 weeks now, talking about different coaches and their report cards entering their respective year with the program. We did Brent Venables. He received a B. We did Matt Rule at Nebraska, received, I think, a B minus or a B. I kind of gave him a hybrid there. Yesterday we did Marcus Freeman, and I gave him an A grade. The clip for that video is going to be dropping later today. Now we discuss how well the USC coach has performed. Lincoln Riley has received a ton of flack and a lot of, what's the word to describe it? Like a lot of, it's not discord. Discord's like an argument between two people. A lot of flack, hate, vitriol might be too strong. Just a strong negative response for the things he said about this team. Lincoln Riley has stated that this is USC's championship window, that he's finally brought the Trojans into a window where he believes they can compete for the playoffs and compete for national titles. And he's received a lot of flack and a strong negative response for that, with critiques about his coaching job through the first 4 years of his tenure, entering year 5. So I want to look at his tenure from my perspective under a microscope and grade him entering year 5. How well has Lincoln Riley performed in your opinion? That's actually as valuable to me as what my analysis is. What's the consensus opinion so I know what the market thinks? Let me know in the comments section down below. And if you have the time, give a justification for why you think that way. For Riley, I can Photoshop that out. There's no worry about that. For Lincoln Riley, we have to remember that he came to USC from Oklahoma, where at Oklahoma he had either won the Big 12 every year and or won double-digit games every year, and never really recruited at a top 5 level, but it was a top 10, top 15 level. Excellent developer and schemer offensively, particularly at quarterback and wide receiver, with good development, but not as elite at O-line, receiver, or tight end in terms of receiver. Think of Mark Andrews, who's had a long NFL career, and running back. Defensively, his best defense was in 2017, and then he had a good defense in the COVID year metrically, but how much of that was real versus, how much of that was maybe the competition, or COVID was a weird year, and yet I still love 2020 Alabama, and I do love that 2020 Oklahoma team too. They started off slow, but finished strong. But he came to USC with the expectation of bringing them back to the mountaintop immediately. I remember in 2022, people preseason were picking them to reach the playoffs, and they nearly did, if not for Kyle Whittingham and Utah beating them 2 times. And there were projections entering the Pac-12 title game that USC would win that game and play in the college football playoff as either the 2 seed or as the 3 seed, or the 3 seed or the 4 seed. Michigan and Georgia were basically locks to be the top 2 seeds for that season. Things fell apart, but they returned Caleb Williams. They returned a plethora of their offensive and defensive talent for the 2023 season. And I remember Dan Mullen, for example, had them firmly in the playoffs. Some even had them winning the national title. And for a guy who has a 76.3% career win-loss record, which is pretty impressive, that was probably his most disappointing season, was 2023. The defense was so embarrassing that Grinch, who had previously fielded very embarrassing defenses himself at USC and Oklahoma, was fired by his friend Lincoln Riley. And he went out and got D'Anton Lynn, who in 24 and 25 improved the defense quite significantly, but they weren't able to take that leap into being top 25, and the offense in 2024 regressed so severely that USC's record was worse, despite fielding, in my opinion, a better team than they did in 2023. Riley since has gone 9-4, 7-2 in the Big Ten last season, did win some road games in Big Ten play, which was an improvement off 2024, but still, in the biggest games outside of that matchup against Michigan, losses to Oregon, to Notre Dame, and a very weird and what should have been avoidable loss to Illinois earlier in the season. Finished 0-2 against the FPI top 10, and against the FPI top 25, I think he actually had a pretty good record, beating Iowa, beating Michigan. I think the Iowa win was more impressive than the Michigan win because Iowa was much better coached, more physical, they were more highly power rated, and it was a game where USC was down big early, and they were able to, claw back and come out with a win, which was really impressive. He's won the Big 12 4 times, had multiple Heisman finalists and Heisman winners. I think that he's a bit underrated now in coaching circles and in some social media circles. He's a lot more like Lane Kiffin than people realize. Him and Kiffin are very, 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 very similar. And yet many have Kiffin top 10 or even top 5. And I think everyone right now would have Riley somewhere in that 15 to 25 range. Some would even have him outside of their top 25. And when you look at USC's trend over the past 5 years, so that's looking at the final year of Clay Helton and the first 4 of Lincoln Riley's tenure, has it been disappointing relative to what we thought USC was going to be under Riley in the first place? I would say so. Yeah, but is it really as disappointing when you have hindsight? Is it, we know it's disappointing. We know he has not lived up to the hype. But is it a complete floundering relative to the expectations that we should have had? Or is it just a disappointment that we should expect to be corrected given the trend of the program? And I would say it's more of the latter than the former. Why would I say that? Well, when he went to USC, keep in mind he had like a transfer class that was among the nation's best because they had basically an entire high school recruiting class size of transfers. At the time, it was one of the largest transfer portal classes ever entering USC in 2022. Clay Helton developed horrifically. He didn't recruit. So Riley had to kind of blow up the foundation and build everything up from the ground. And we saw success early on because they hit on a lot of their transfers. Caleb Williams was phenomenal, and the next, round 1, pick 1, Lincoln Riley quarterback. And they overachieved. That team had plenty of close wins and close games against inferior competition. They did not play a very tough schedule, avoiding Washington and Oregon that year. And the one great team they played that season in the regular season was Utah, who they lost to in close fashion and then got dominated by in the Pac-12 title game. That team was much closer in reality to an 8-4 or 9-3 caliber team than an 11-1 team. They overachieved. And that didn't help the following season or seasons after, where people then thought, because they won 11 games this year, that means they're going to be really, really, really good in the future. And while Riley made the mistake of bringing Grinch with him, and that was very disappointing, that extended the need to rebuild the foundation. If he, say, brings in a better defensive coordinator in year 1, they're probably 1 or 2 years ahead of where they are right now, honestly. Don't know that for sure because we don't have the perfect counterfactual, but Grinch is and was awful. That was a bad decision by him. But he also was ahead of schedule and didn't quite have the talent yet that he needed to win them titles, not just compete for a playoff spot, which is different. So he had to blow it up after Grinch. They continued to recruit at a decent level. In entering the 2023 class, they had a really good class because they hit on the portal. They then had like typical Riley OU classes after that were top 20, top 15. Not overall impressive though, just kind of raising the floor slowly over time. And then we get to the 2026 recruiting class. It's the best in America. They didn't do much in the transfer portal, but they did get some key pieces, and they brought back the most starters in all of college football. And now Riley is recruiting at a level that he never did at OU, never did at USC. He has more alignment at USC, I think, than he ever did at OU or previously in his first 2 or 3 years. And they have an amount of returning production that they've never really had in terms of like roster returning production from the previous year, not returning production that factors in incoming transfers. And look at 2025. There's no doubt the 2025 team was much better and superior than the 2024 team. And a lot of that team comes back with probably a better staff than what USC had in the 2025 season. This was a team that in EPA per play margin was top 5. They were top 15 in many other categories and statistics, success rate margin, points per play margin, yards per point margin, not quite, but that's because they weren't always efficient as they drove down the field and sometimes had to settle for field goals or turned over the football, and their special teams wasn't good. They were top 15 in FPI, FEI, 17th in efficiency, 16th in S&P+. And keep in mind, a lot of that factors in the bowl season. And for USC in particular, with some of the opt-outs they had, and really any team in the bowl season, I don't care about that much. This was a top 15 team last year, and they profile as a top 10 team this coming season, which means you might see the best USC team ever under Riley this season in terms of how equipped they are to win a title. 2022 USC, if they made the playoffs, let me tell you what would have happened. They may have upset Michigan because TCU did, and USC was probably a little bit worse, a worse version of TCU that year. Maybe they could have, if they would have matched up with TCU, they probably would have been favored over them, or it would have been a very tight spread. They were never beating Georgia that year. They would have lost that game by 4 or 5 touchdowns. And against Michigan, because they were a little bit worse than TCU, especially on defense, they probably would have lost handily to Michigan that year too. In 23, 24, and 25, we know for a fact they weren't winning at all with how they played. This season, I don't think they're quite there yet. But when your win total's at 8.5 with a schedule that includes Oregon, Washington, Penn State, Ohio State, and Indiana, all those teams will probably be rated inside the top 25. And it's not like at Wisconsin's a cakewalk. I don't think at UCLA with what Chesney's doing is a cakewalk. That's indicative of this team being top 15 or top 10 in power ratings. So with Lincoln Riley and USC, when I factor in what they look like entering this season, where they're going, what they're building towards, and what they've done in the first 4 seasons, and maybe this is very recency biased, maybe it is with incredible amounts of foresight that could be very wrong, I'm going to give him a B+. Can't give him an A, not even an A-, because the record's been disappointing. But with what they did last year and where they're going, and the fact that he was able to make a complete, or maybe not complete, but at least a partial philosophic change on defense without losing what he had on offense, that's special. If any NFL team had an opportunity to hire anyone in college football to be a coordinator, it would be Lincoln Riley for OC. He's one of the brightest minds in the sport. They've figured out NIL. They've figured out recruiting. They have figured out coordinator, I think. And keep in mind, a huge problem with Riley's teams was a strength and conditioning element with Benny Wiley. They got rid of him before fall camp last year. So Tremaine Carroll was kind of put in the same position that Dana Holgorsen was at Nebraska, where he didn't have a full preseason to work with his players on that side of the ball. This is really Tremaine Carroll's first full year as the strength and conditioning coach. And I'm excited to see what that does for the USC program. Very high on USC in the future. Don't know how high I am on them record-wise entering 2026, but I'm looking right now. I think I had them 8-4 in my winter predictions. I'm looking at 9-3 with them currently, if that provides any context at all. With Texas Tech, I know that Brennan Sorsby is no longer the starting quarterback. Bless me. I understand that he's not going to be eligible, or probably won't be. But I still think that Texas Tech reloaded this season. The Texas Tech Red Raiders have a superior roster in 2026 compared to 2025, even with the absence of Brennan Sorsby. Let's dive into how they did it. So, first and foremost, what led to Texas Tech's season last year was a brilliant effort in scouting, development, and scheme. Because keep in mind, they didn't bring in the 19th best recruiting class for 2025. They're bringing it in for 2026. They went 12-2, were a top 10 team across the board in metrics, and were top 5 in efficiency because they hired a great DC in Sheil Wood. Mac Leftwich is a great offensive mind. And they went out and they got offensive linemen in the portal. They got some receivers in the portal. They were able to bring in David Bailey, Romello Height. They were able to bring in Skylar Jill Howard, AJ Holmes, Lee Hunter, and they hit on all those guys. They developed them further than the prior schools did. Rodriguez was exclusively developed at Texas Tech, and he was a day 2 linebacker. Roberts played well, and the scheme and the players all meshed. They have one of the best general managers in the country in James Blanchard. That's why Notre Dame wanted him. We all know Freeman's a top 10 head coach. He knows how to identify good coaching staffs. They wanted him to replace Chad Bowden, who left for USC, and Texas Tech was able to keep Blanchard. And you're seeing why Blanchard got that big raise and why he's highly respected as a GM. Because look at what they did last year with a talent composite that wasn't quite Indiana low, but was still well outside of the range of a typical top 10 team. And what they did against Oregon in that Orange Bowl showed what great evaluation and development can do, and also what alignment and NIL can do so that you can go out and get those players. And they've done that again this cycle. Look at the top transfer portal classes per On3. Indiana is first. Texas Tech is second. And those were probably the top 2 portal classes last year, all things considered, with how much they hit on their evaluations and how well they developed those portal players and their rosters in general. And the fact that, yes, they spent big money for sure. I mean, David Bailey was courted by Texas, and ultimately it was Texas Tech who got him. If Texas got David Bailey last year, they probably are in the playoffs. Like one of Florida, Georgia, or Ohio State. Bailey was a good enough player where, with Florida and Ohio State being close and Georgia being close until that onside kick, they probably win one of those games with another NFL pass rusher to pair with Colin Simmons. I'm not saying that money wasn't a factor here. Indiana with Mendoza, he was going to call Kirby Smart and commit to Georgia, and he waited on it. But there's also players such as Romello Height, who I know were not viewed in the way David Bailey was. They got him, and he excelled. I know they didn't view, and by they I mean national college football teams or scouts or media types, they didn't view Skylar Jill Howard as something who was particularly special. And despite getting injured, he got drafted still, and he was one of Texas Tech's best defensive tackles. Lee Hunter was not viewed as a potential first-round pick. He got picked on day 2, but some had him mocked day 1. He wasn't viewed that way last year, and he went there and he balled out and did a phenomenal job. And Bryce Pollock from Mississippi State, he did well at Texas Tech. And now you're looking at another class where they bring in Adam Trick, for example. They bring in Julian LaVenture, Mateen Iboragba, Bryce Butler. They bring in Austin Romaine, Corey Platt, and that defense is going to reload. I don't know if it'll be 100% of what it was last year, but it should be 90% of what it was last year. And among the 2025 college football playoff field in returning production, Texas Tech's only behind Oregon and Georgia. They're ahead of A&M. And I'll tell you, even though they're similar in roster, the caliber of the returning production for Texas Tech, it's better than A&M. And that's factoring in Sorsby transferring in, yes. I don't think Connolly is that quite updated yet, especially since there isn't an official ruling. But I think even without Sorsby, Tech is the better roster than A&M. And they have a better roster than anyone on this list, I would say, outside of Oregon, Georgia, Indiana, Ohio State, Miami, like those five. And it's debatable with many of those. Oregon, certainly not. I would take Ohio State's and Georgia's, and I'd probably take Indiana. Probably take most of those with the absence of Sorsby, but it's debatable with a lot of those, especially when you factor out Oregon. That is a testament to their staff and their process and their scouting department, where they've been killing it. They've been absolutely killing it. And last year, they fielded a team that was, I mean, truly, if they had Brennan Sorsby last year and were a bit better on the offensive line, could they have won it all? I don't know, but they really weren't that far away from beating Oregon if they had different pieces. And even without Sorsby, if Hammond is healthy and takes a step forward, and their receiver, tight end, running back, and offensive line groups improve the way I think they will, they could be that team this season. They were third in S&P Plus, sixth in FPI and FEI, and fifth in game control. They truly had a great team. And while Joey McGuire is a coach that I'm not particularly high on as one of the best in the business, 35-18, and they were really good last year. They have all the resources in the world. They recruit at a high level. And after last year, I don't know if anyone can say that they don't develop well or they don't scout well. So they have some other things down besides just blowing the money cannon. I do think they're set up well to have success in the future. It's not just Texas Tech and money. They also have good evals. They have great recruiting, great scouting. So they're checking almost all of these boxes to be a top player and top contender in the future. And I talked about the defense mostly because that was the best side of the football last year. But think about bringing in Malcolm Simmons or Jalen Jones or bringing in Jordan Church on the offensive line. Like those are some key pieces too. Let me know if you think Texas Tech is going to repeat their return, if they're going to return to the college football playoff this fall or not. I think that they nailed the portal so well that even with Sorsby's absence, they've convinced me that they're going to return to the playoffs for sure. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about Arch Manning, Ohio State's wide receiver class, and about whether or not USC is going to beat Ohio State this year. It's a bold prediction someone made. Is Arch Manning overrated or underrated entering September? Or technically the season starts in August, but who cares? Let me know in the comments section below. I want to take us through Arch Manning's games against his 4 toughest opponents per ESPN's FPI and look at how he progressed throughout the season, because a lot of people are saying that he still sucks. A lot of people are saying he's a lock for round 1, pick 1. And it feels a lot like the conjecture we had about Manning last year, except there's more division. Last year, there was more of a consensus that he was going to be good. And this year, there's much more of a sharp divide. And I think that the truth does lie closer to one side, but more in the middle of both camps. Arch Manning against Ohio State. He entered as the favorite to win the Heisman, as the favorite to be round 1, pick 1. As a redshirt sophomore, 5-star of high school, 6'4", 220, he had wheels, limitless arm talent, and one of the first passes he throws against Ohio State is a dirted ball to an open receiver. And as the game progresses, there's this feeling of, oh boy, we're in trouble. We are in deep, deep trouble. And Texas in that game outgained Ohio State by 100 yards. And look, if you change a play call here or a play call there, they could have won. They were winning the lines of scrimmage in that game. They just had the worst QB and wide receiver play. And on Ohio State's 4th and goal, they punched it in. On Texas's 4th and goal, they did not. That was really the difference in that game. It was a very competitive contest. Manning had a PFF grade of 75.4. I kind of do disagree with that. I don't know how he got that high of a grade. He He had one touchdown pass and a beautiful throw to Parker Livingston, and he had one interception, fairly low QBR, as it was revealed how good Ohio State's defense was. That was clearly one of the better offenses Ohio State faced all season long, even with the struggles at quarterback. He looked pretty rough in that game, though. Clearly raw, clearly scared, and just was really inaccurate in the short and medium game. Pretty good in the deep game, though. With his grades against Oklahoma, let's talk about leading up to the Oklahoma game. Texas lost to Ohio State. Manning looked very inconsistent against San Jose State and UTEP. Sam Houston City looked great, but Sam Houston State was awful, and everyone knew it. Against Florida, he had a good game, but he had no pass protection. Florida owned the lines of scrimmage, and Texas had its second loss of the season. And Napier still got fired after that. That's how bad he was. Texas entered the Red River Shootout, the Red River Rivalry, whatever you want to call it, unranked. And yet they were favored. And that blew people's minds. Like, everyone was picking OU. I had some bad picks, but one of my better picks of the year was picking Texas to win that game. Like, they're favored for a reason. They're going to win. And he had a PFF grade of 84.2, a touchdown, no picks, 21 of 27. And in the quick game, him and Sark combined with Texas's defense eating Mateer alive, just cooked OU slowly. It was like, putting a skewer through a turkey or a chicken and just slowly turning over the fire. And then that punt return by Ryan Niblett ultimately sealed the game. But he played really well. In that game, he finally looked like he could be evolving into a good quarterback. You then get to the Georgia game, and leading up to that matchup, we watched the Kentucky game where Texas should have lost, and they kind of looked like Iowa. They showed some heart against Mississippi State in a comeback win, but Mississippi State was also pretty terrible. And you get to a place where Texas, it feels like their offense is finally starting to come alive a bit. And against Georgia, who was a team that, struggled after Texas shredded Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt tried to come back, but really that game was over pretty early. Manning had a 92 QBR and 189 passer rating. He had a phenomenal game. There's this thought that maybe Texas has something against Georgia, and they kept it competitive, and Georgia slowly was being figured out by Texas offensively as the game went on. But Georgia looked like the better team. They were playing better, and they kick the onside kick, and at that point, it's game over. Georgia goes up. I think it was 21-10. They kick the onside kick, and it's 28-10 after that. And at that point, the game is over. Texas wasn't even outgained by over 100 yards, and Manning got a QBR in the mid-60s, just wasn't adequately protected as he got sacked 3 times. And, he showed some flashes in that game, but still, road environment, great defensive mind, didn't play all that well. And against Texas A&M, great defensive mind, not as impressive of a defensive roster, but at home, and he had a 91.9 QBR. 14 of 29 for 179 yards, a touchdown. And that one touchdown pass that he threw in that game was almost overthrown. Ryan Wingo had to, had to jump up in the air and come down with that thing with a really impressive catch. But it was a nice touch pass otherwise. And then he had that long 35-yard run against Texas A&M, where as the year progressed, he became more confident, showed some of his dynamic scrambling ability. You saw that again against Michigan. I don't think that he's the number 1 college quarterback this year. I do believe he's round 1, pick 1, and as close as you can be as a lock for that. He has so much talent. He did show progress last year. It's clearly all there for him to succeed. I still think that he is a bit raw. Even at the end of last year when he was playing as one of the better quarterbacks in the country, he was not as accurate as Mendoza was. He was not that good. He was not as good of a college quarterback as Chambliss or others that I'm just going to throw out there but not directly mention. I think that Chambliss and Mendoza at the end of the year, definitely better college QBs. And there are probably a handful of others, maybe Dante Moore, even Gunnar Stockton, that I think were debatable at the end of the year. Julian Sayin, for example, Maeva. But when you combine him taking another step in this offense, him having a better supporting cast, better protection, a full year starting under his belt, and his limitless upside, he will be one of the best quarterbacks in the country this year. I would think that he's going to be top 5 this year, and at the very worst, top 10. When last year in totality, he was not a top 10 quarterback. He was at the end of the year, but in totality, with that rough start, no. So is he overrated or underrated? I'm going to say at the end of this segment, I think the answer is kind of up to you guys. I would say right now, with the consensus big boards and what the analysts are saying, he's probably properly rated. Many of them are high on him. By the public, I would say he is probably a bit underrated. I think many of them saw his struggles and how horrible he was in September and kind of tuned out there and then just didn't see him improve in October and November. I think the jury is still out on him a little bit as to whether or not he's going to be a generational college QB, but he's certainly one of the most talented QBs, if not the most talented in the country. And you look at his progression from September to November, and I think that you're being a bit dishonest if you think he isn't one of the top 10 college QBs, which is different from how good you'll do in the NFL entering the fall. For Ohio State's wide receiver room, another unit that is all about talent. It's a very, very talented position. Ohio State loses Carnell Tate, obviously. They bring back Jeremiah Smith. And the question is, how much of a drop-off will you see in the wide receiver room, as Tate was a top 5 pick? And is Chris Henry Jr. or Brock Boyd or someone who's going to slide in there and immediately be what Tate was, or maybe what Smith was as a true freshman? We'll see. The odds of that are probably astronomically low. But they have supremely talented players in that room from the 2026 recruiting class. Can Ohio State keep this 2026 recruiting class off the field with Brock Boyd, Chris Henry Jr., and just how talented they are, being the first freshmen to lose their black stripes for winter, spring football camp entering 2026. There's no offseason around here. There's only the preseason, so you're not going to hear me say they lost it in the offseason. And for Ohio State, there's no offseason there either. You're always going at full go. And Brock Boyd was an example of that with his time in high school in Texas, where he was a 3-star of high school, very undervalued, I would say, given how quickly he lost his black stripe. Boyd was previously committed to TCU. Ohio State offers him, and he goes to Ohio State, where he is a freshman right now at 6'1", 184 pounds, recruited by Brian Hartline. As a sophomore in 2023, he had 800 yards and 7 touchdowns. In 2024, as a junior, he had almost 2,000 receiving yards, 1,875, and 19 touchdowns. He was a pretty phenomenal player in high school. When you're a phenomenal player in Texas high school, you're probably a 4-star at worst. And he gets to Ohio State and he loses his black stripe faster than Chris Henry Jr. does. He hasn't gotten the hype Chris Henry has because Chris Henry's 6'5" and was more highly touted of high school. But Boyd losing his black stripe first is something that we should all be paying attention to. Henry was top 15, nearly decommitted from Ohio State to commit to Oregon, but decided to stay with the Buckeyes. And in the spring game, he had some impressive catches. Now, with the spring game, I don't really care about spring games all that much. I care about what I hear in practice. That's why, despite the fact that Brock Boyd did not have the same amazing, deep catch that Henry had, I mentioned him because he lost his black stripe. That's indicative of him playing well throughout multiple spring practices. And just one spring practice that happens to be televised is something that's not going to change my mind from my preseason research. I do expect Henry to play some, though. And I think that if you're a Buckeye, you should hope that he does, because he is the second most talented player. It's him or Boyd are the second most talented players in that room. Kyle Parker, McCune, who transferred in from UTSA, Innis, they have some talent, but they don't have NFL talent, like first round NFL talent. Smith obviously does. If you were just going off of best prospects, he'd be a lock for round 1, pick 1 next year. Henry, and just given how successful Boyd was, maybe even he, are those like wide receiver U type receivers. And the fact that possibly 2 of them and certainly 1 of them are a part of this receiver class means that it's going to be hard to keep them off the field. I do think for Henry that he will certainly have a few hundred receiving yards and a few receiving touchdowns, just based on some of my early projections. And I would expect Brock Boyd as well, given how quickly he burned his black stripe and the fact that receiver room's older than previous Buckeye receiver rooms, but isn't nearly as talented. I think that they're going to, whether for the whole year or once they get into the schedule, they're just going to start playing the most talented players, and that will be some of these true freshmen that they have. The one who hasn't lost his black stripe yet and went under the radar but quickly rose throughout the rankings was Draquan Guilford. He was a top 40 player out of high school, first in Indiana, and he's listed on Ohio State's R-Lads depth chart. So as someone who is like a third string or second string wide receiver right now, and he rose quickly through the rankings, having tremendous success at Indiana's high school, has not quite lost his black stripe yet, at least to my knowledge. But I think that losing Brian Hartline is something that, like any program who would lose any coach like that, there's going to be a long-term difference or step back. There just is. But to think that Ohio State's going to go from having like the best receiver room for multiple years in a row to just being good there, I think is also a bit like that would be a bit of an over-exaggeration. I think that this wide receiver room this year, you're going to see Smith, who's the best wide receiver group in America. You're going to see kind of the new Ohio State wide receiver room. And I think there's going to still be plenty of talent and plenty of NFL players there, even in Hartline's absence. And I would expect that whether it's Guilford, whether it's Boyd, whether it's Chris Henry Jr., I think that you're going to see them play. They're going to play the best players. I know that Ohio State sometimes has been notorious, according to its fans. I don't know how much I believe this, for never playing, the best players. That's a case at a lot of different schools when the best players are young or raw. Think of Quinn Ewers versus Arch Manning. Like, yes, Manning had more upside, but was he as consistent as Ewers? Absolutely not. I think that if they truly are the best players, they're going to play them over even some of the vets they brought in from the portal or vets they already have on the team. Think of Jeremiah Smith. He was amazing. He was already the best receiver in that room, so they started him immediately. Like, this staff knows what they're doing. And as to whether or not they're going to keep these guys off the field, it just depends on how good they actually are. So I'm excited to see how good this Buckeye wide receiver room is. And as for the 2026 class, I mean, just based on the measurables, how good Hartline was as an evaluator and developer at the receiver room, I would expect at least someone from this, like from that receiver class of 3 to be a first-round draft pick in the future. Finally, let's talk about some of my viewers' bold predictions before we get on out of here. According to someone, Michael Smith Geo11G, USC is going to beat Ohio State this fall. So I want to react to this and give this a grade on the boldness scale. Michael Smith-Go11G predicts in one of my bold prediction posts that USC will beat the Ohio State Buckeyes this fall. I'm going to just analyze this game, what I think the matchups could be, talk about both teams, and then at the end, give a rating of boldness for this prediction. Let's first take a look at Ohio State staff. I want to start with the staffs for both of these programs. I think that's the most appropriate place to start. Ohio State has a top 3 coach in Ryan Day. He's battling with Kirby Smart and Cignetti for being the best coach in college football. 82-12 win-loss record. Arthur Smith comes over from Pittsburgh, where he's the offensive coordinator of an average NFL offense. This will be his first year. Matt Patricia is here, back in Columbus, as the highest paid coordinator in college football, entering his second season. He had a defense last year that was first in points led per game, first in points allowed per play, second in yards led per play, third in efficiency per FEI, first in S&P plus defense, and second in FEI defense. Patricia is one of the best defensive coordinators in the sport. Ryan Day is one of the best head coaches in the sport. I wouldn't say Arthur Smith's one of the best OCs in the sport, but I would say that given his time in the NFL and given how he could mesh with what Ryan Day's offense is, I would expect him to be certainly a good offensive coordinator, and maybe better than that. I'd peg him as a top 15 offensive coordinator, top 20, top 15, somewhere in between 11 and 20 in OCs right now. That's without seeing how he meshes with this. He had success in the NFL, but wasn't quite as successful in the NFL as Patricia. This is one of the best staffs in college football. When you look at the assistants, the coordinators, the head coach, the scouts, the strength and conditioning, all these different things, they have a top 3 staff. Their staff, Georgia's, Indiana's. Those are the top 3 staffs in college football. USC's has a lot of upside to it. I think Riley right now is a top 15 to top 20 head coach, and he's starting to be underrated by some national types. He's also the offensive coordinator of the team, de facto. I know Heward has that title, but he's not really the play caller. It's Riley. Riley is the de facto OC. I would probably put it number 1 there. He's one of the best offensive coordinators in college football. I'd put him as the best, I would say. Gary Patterson, as the defensive coordinator, will enter year 1. He's been out of coaching for a little bit, but was the developer of the 4-2-5 Mint defense, and he's going to be running that scheme with USC. At TCU, his defense in 2021 was pretty terrible, but there's a difference between being a head coach, where I don't think Patterson was the play caller there, if my memory serves me correctly, and now he's only going to be focusing on the defense. Patricia, for example, at Ohio State, horrible head coach in the NFL, absolutely awful, but fantastic defensive coordinator at both the college and NFL level. USC staff isn't quite Ohio State good, but I would still tab them as one of the better staffs in the sport. So the coaching edge would go to Ohio State for sure, but USC is good enough as a staff where maybe in a single game sample size they could outcoach that Ohio State staff. It's just not likely. Ohio State also had the much better team last year. They were first in EPA per play and success rate margin, 4th and 3rd in points per play and yards per point margin, respectively. And they were top 2 almost unanimously in power ratings, with only FEI and game control rating them 3rd, only behind the Oregon Ducks there. And that was due to I think, their performance in big games and a limited sample size in big games, where there are only 3 top 15 FPI opponents. Indiana and Miami beat them, and quite handily beat them on the lines of scrimmage, and did not beat them in a flukish way. It was competitive. Those were both games where, with hindsight, I think Indiana beats Ohio State literally 5 out of 5, 6 maybe, or 5 out of 10, maybe 6 out of 10 times, because they had the QB and lines of scrimmage edge. And then with Miami probably beats them 3 out of 10, 4 out of 10 times they had the pick six. And with Texas, it was also a very similar coin flippy game. They outgained Ohio State and almost had a flukishly low fourth down conversion rate, but Ohio State won that game and probably wins that game, I would say, 5 or 6 times out of 10, given how that game went. They were a top 5 team last year. They were among the best, and it was a little bit disappointing for them, just a little bit to not win it all. But I think in the grand scheme of things, they had an A or A plus season. To field a 12-2 team, beat Michigan, compete for the Big Ten title, receive a top 2 seed when they lost as much as they did, that speaks to how good that staff is, how good that program is, the culture that's there. Right now, they're the number 1 program in college football, in large part because of how well they reloaded. USC, let's not get this mistaken. They had a great team last year. But again, just not quite Ohio State good. They will return more than Ohio State this year. They return more starters. They return more production. They also, just given what they bring back versus what Ohio State does, Ohio State will probably regress in power ratings and USC will improve. But is it by so much that it makes up for the massive gap that was in between those teams? I wouldn't say so. No. USC was worse in all of these metrics that we just discussed. They were the best in EPA per play margin. They had a good success rate in points per play margin. Thankfully for the Trojans, they played far better at home than on the road, and they'll be hosting Ohio State this year, not traveling to Ohio State. If they traveled to Ohio State, I would tell you guys this right now. Beating Ohio State on the road for USC, I'd give that a 10 out of 10 on the boldness scale, just because of the history of teams and how they perform traveling across that many time zones, especially like Big Ten and Pac-12 cross-country travel. The history that's just not favoring for the road team. And I do think Ohio State's going to be better. They have the better staff. They have the better roster. So on a neutral field, more times out of 10, more times than 5 out of 10, rather, Ohio State's going to win this thing. And yes, Ohio State's defense was insane last year. Their offense, not quite. It was one of the more inferior EPA per rushing offenses, and it's probably even worse than it was metrically, because when you have the receivers Ohio State does, defenses have to treat that offense differently, and Ohio State could pass to open up the run. And even when they tried to do that, they couldn't really do it. It was a truly dreadful rushing offense last year. And while I disagree often with S&P Plus's methodology of some things, I was just talking about this in a different segment, how I thought they overrated Texas Tech's offense, overrated Michigan's defense. I do appreciate how because it's really a lot of like points per play type stuff from what I can tell. Efficiency and FEI doesn't quite care as much about that. Ohio State's offense per S&P Plus was outside the top 10, and it was an offense that was outside the top 10 points per play, too. It was Day's worst offense when you take into account that against the 3 best teams they played, they scored 12.6 points per game. The Ohio State offense in 2023, for context, against the best teams they played, I think they scored, the 3 best were Notre Dame, Penn State, and Michigan. They scored 24, 20, and 17. They scored just over 20 points. And the average of those defenses that year were better than the best 3 defenses Ohio State played last year. They were more talented. They were just a little bit better overall. That was Day's worst defense ever or worst offense ever at Ohio State. And possibly it was combined with his best defense ever, and that resulted in 12-2. An area where Ohio State could be weak at again is special teams. In theory, last year they fixed the kicking game by bringing in Jackson Corville, and he never played, and fielding was awful. They did bring in a good kicker from Baylor and Connor Hawkins, and I do think he'll improve them a bit, but there is just something fundamentally broken about that special teams unit that I'm going to have to see before I believe it's going to be good. The defense I would expect to be top 10, maybe top 5. It's not going to be worse than top 10. The offense last year, I would say if you care more about big games, it may not have even been top 15. It just had a ridiculously high floor because of it it had a ridiculously high floor because the NFL talent at receiver, but the ceiling was ultimately capped by the fact that their O-line would melt like a stick of butter out on a road in Texas in the summer when it played against like great defensive lines. I think the O-line will be better, receiver will be worse, but running back and QB will be better. Tight end and receiver are worse, I think. O-line, running back, and QB will be better. So I do think this offense's floor is going to be higher, or maybe about the same. I do think the ceiling will be higher too, because they should be able to have a more balanced attack. So the Ohio State Buckeyes this year will probably regress in power ratings, but by how much? Probably not by that much. I have them right now as a top 5 or top 4 team. They're fighting for me, it's anywhere between 5 and 3 is where they're fighting for in my ratings right now. USC just isn't there. I don't have them top 5. I can see a world where they're top 5, and by that I likely mean like 5th, but that's less likely than even the world where I can see Ohio State being number 1. Again, their offense was better than Ohio State's last year, but that defense was like at best a top 50 unit. And much like Ohio State, the special teams was an atrocity to watch at times. I do expect USC to improve everywhere because of how much they bring back. The fact I believe they upgraded at defensive coordinator. They'll finally have a full year with Tremaine Carroll at strength and conditioning coach, and their talent is just rising at a very impressive level. But, as I've mentioned earlier, Ohio State is going to be the better team. We've established that. They will be favored in this game. If they are not favored in this game, then USC's going to win. Just because of the benefit of the doubt that Ohio State gets and USC does not, for reasonable reasons, and the fact that Ohio State's more talented and from a preseason angle is going to be better. If Ohio State's an underdog, that means these teams are comparable, or USC's better, or Ohio State's slightly better. And in any of those scenarios, the cross-country travel probably takes over and gives USC the win. For Ohio State, I'm looking at their defense, and then we'll look at USC's offense to set up how they'll match up against each other. Ohio State's offense is going to be great at everything across the board. I think their strongest spot this year will be safety. They will have a noticeable step back there due to Downs' departure, but they were fantastic at safety last year, even better the year before. This year, they'll still have like a top 10 or top 5 safety room. They just won't definitely have the number 1 safety in college football. They'll upgrade slightly at corner. I don't know if Sanchez will be as good as Igbenogson last year, but he'll be close, and they bring back Jermaine Matthews, and I like what they did in the portal in that room. Linebacker, they'll still be a top 15 or top 10 unit there. They just won't be number 1 by a mile. And then for the D-line, D-tackle will regress. D-end, I could see take a step forward. In theory, from an NFL talent angle, it is better than it was last year, and they are probably deeper across the board on the D-line. We'll just have to see how that pans out. Like Johnson or Laurinaitis is the best position coach on that defensive side of the football, and Johnson returns a lot more than Laurinaitis does, and he didn't have the same unit that Laurinaitis did last year. So, like, regression to the mean tells you Ohio State's D-line is going to look pretty similar to last year. Linebacker is where you're going to see a step back. They're going to be top 10 in most of these categories. Some you'll probably see them fall to just being top 15, top 20, or top 25, because they were top 10 in everything but takeaways per game last year. But they'll still be strong in defending the run and defending the pass. For USC's offense, I think if there's one thing they could have an edge in here, because we're talking about USC winning this game, so how do they do that? And we've established they'll be the underdog, so how do they overcome that? One thing that I think they could beat Ohio State in here is if Ohio State's linebackers are not NFL caliber this year. And the odds say that even if they are like going to be future draft picks, due to how young Pettyjohn is and the fact that Pierce was clearly behind the other two physically and just as a player, that they will step back. USC with Maeva, their receivers, Mark Bowman with a few games under his belt, and that rushing attack with the O-line and King Miller and Wayman Jordan, they could use RPO to their advantage here, I think. It depends a lot on how well Ohio State's defense reloads up the middle, and Ohio State reloading up the middle with how much generational talent they lost means they regress, just not by much. For example, I was not high enough on Ohio State last year. It's something that I'm kind of mad at with hindsight, but they were clearly worse than they were in 2024. Even in the regular season when they were bombing people, it was obvious they were not their 2024 selves. And that was clearly known in their final 2 games, where it was in particular evident that the offense was not nearly what it was in 2024. What you have is a offense that will probably have a lines of scrimmage disadvantage, just talent v. talent. But potentially with the scheme here, USC could have a schematic edge with their offense against Ohio State's defense, depending on how well the linebackers do and depending on the size of Ohio State's talent edge on the D-line. It all depends on that there. Remember, USC last year, especially on the road, was not good with taking care of the football. At home, they were pretty good at that, though. And Ohio State's defense with Patricia, and it was similar with some of the Knowles defenses beforehand, were not that good at forcing turnovers. They were very much keep everything in front of us, make sure they're pretty much always in an obvious passing down on third down, get off the field, get the offense back on. They were those type of defenses. And those are typically better than the defenses that are always have an emphasis on forcing turnovers. Those defenses do it because they're either as talented as those defenses and then they have an even better scheme or somehow like even better players, or they do it because they have to be a good defense, a la like USC's or Oklahoma's under Alex Grinch. But this USC offense was top 10 in most categories last year, and they should be even better than they were. For Ohio State's offense, going to keep it short and sweet here. If they can run the ball and like run it at a high level, it's going to be not impossible for USC to win, but very, very challenging for them. They were already second in third down conversion percentage last year, despite having a fairly mediocre, like above average, maybe pass blocking O-line and not being able to run the football at a high level. And they were able to convert these third down conversions because Sayin is uber accurate and they had great receivers. And people can criticize the play calling all they want, but like it's still Ohio State. So like the talent edge, having an offensive mind in Ryan Day being the head coach and being involved in the game plan, and they having good tight ends, having a running back in Bo Jackson that could, break contact, that could get yards after contact. I still expect this receiver room to be a top 5 unit in football. That's why it earns an A+ from me. Sayin is going to be a top 5 QB. If he's not quite top 5, it's because he's the 6th or 7th best quarterback. He's going to be phenomenal in a deeper quarterback class than what we had last year. Tight end, I expect them to get worse at just because of how highly Kazmarek and Claire got drafted, and no one they got from the portal is quite as good of a blocker as Kazmarek from what I know of, or as talented of an overall tight end as Claire. The O-line should improve, losing their best player to the portal, which was a positive, and having as much cohesion as they do and likely having better play calling. This offense, when looking at USC's defense, the one area for USC, what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to do a better job stopping the run because they were horrible at that last year. And if you're horrible at stopping the run against Ohio State, well, you can't make them one-dimensional because you're never going to shut down that passing attack. What USC needs to do in this game, I think their D-line's pretty good. In the same way that I believe Ohio State's D-line will have an edge over USC's D-line talent-wise, I do expect USC's D-line to have an edge over this Ohio State O-line, talent-wise. So scheming is going to be very important for both of these offenses against both D-lines, try to mitigate that edge. USC's defense will need to get pressure, and they'll need to do a good enough job stopping the run where they have say in obvious passing situations and can hope that they take a step enough forward to really frustrate them there. Or if it is a shootout and USC's in the game, maybe they can get the game-sealing turnover instead of the Buckeyes. But this defense for USC was rough last year, far worse than Ohio State's offense was. Ohio State's offense was just great, but they weren't elite. USC's defense couldn't even hold a candle to great. I expect them to improve at every position from a fundamental soundness angle. Talent-wise, they might drop off at linebacker, but they'll improve everywhere else. Ultimately, how I see this prediction unfolding is I would give it a 1 isn't bold at all, 10 is impossible or very close to it. I'm leaning in between a 7 and an 8 here. I'm going to give it a 7, which a 7 is bold, but it's not a hot take. And the reason I say that is this is a game where Ohio State's going to be traveling multiple time zones over. They'll have a bye before this game, but they'll also have played at Indiana in their most recent game, and then they have to play Oregon at home. So that's so many tough games in a row that if they don't drop it to Indiana, they're liable to drop one of the next two. At least the odds would say. And USC's improving as a team. Ohio State's probably taking a bit of a step back, but Ohio State will still be favored in this game by anywhere between, I think, 3 and 7 points. And if not by that, it will be by closer to 10 than closer to USC being favored. It's bold, but it's not nigh impossible, or it's not improbable. It's just unlikely. So I'm giving this a 7 on the boldness scale. Right now, I would pick Ohio State to win this thing, but there is a path for USC to win, and it does have some realism to it. That's it, everyone. Stream went a little bit longer than I expected, but thank you for being flexible with me taking that break. These videos will be up in the next 48 hours, and there are more videos on the way. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like the stream, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and I will see you all tomorrow at noon Eastern time. Thank you guys so much. More content is on the way.